I'm Alex, and I've compiled mountain deaths that are deserving of Darwin Awards. From a climber on Everest who kept pulling off her oxygen mask to argue with her Sherpa, to a fitness entrepreneur on the North Face who ignored her guide's calls and wandered alone into a whiteout. It was May 17, 2016, on the south col of Mount Everest, a wind-stripped saddle at 26,000 feet, where the temperature that evening was falling below -20. The thin air doesn't announce what it's doing to a person. It just quietly disassembles them from the inside out. And by the time the symptoms are visible to anyone watching, it is already too late. Laurie Vanden was 41 and worked as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company based in Phoenix, Arizona. She had completed several Himalayan trekking expeditions over 4 years, and had summited 2 peaks above 20,000 feet through commercial, guided programs. Her Everest permit had cost roughly $65,000, a figure she referenced often enough that other expedition members later told investigators they knew the number before they knew her name. She had joined a commercial guiding operation out of Kathmandu and arrived at base camp in early April with gear that was mostly still tagged on arrival. She had no prior experience above 24,000 feet and had never spent a night in the death zone. Her lead guide had flagged concerns about her acclimatization pace to FETA operations staff during the rotation weeks. She pushed back on rest days repeatedly. Other team members described her as someone who treated the mountain the way she treated quarterly targets, as a problem to be solved through force of will, not biology. By 6:30 p.m., wind gusts were reaching 40 miles per hour across the col, and the temperature had dropped sharply since late afternoon. Most climbers had retreated to their tents for rest before the planned pre-dawn summit push. Laurie had not. Witnesses told investigators she had been moving between tents for roughly an hour, verbally expressing dissatisfaction with her tent assignment, cursing at her guide, and the pace of logistical preparations on a mountain where pace is dictated by survival, not preference. Eric Valois later described seeing Laurie pacing near the edge of Camp 4 around 7:40 p.m., already on supplemental oxygen, but repeatedly pulling her mask off to argue, exposing herself to air that barely sustained consciousness, let alone physical exertion. Each removal made her breathing faster and shallower. Eric said he called out to her twice. She did not respond to either call. I personally think the first time she pulled that mask off to make a point, it significantly worsened her hypoxic state and reduced her chances of recovery. Tashi, a Sherpa guide assigned to the expedition, saw her attempt to walk unassisted toward the fixed rope line. Her movements had gone erratic. She planted her trekking pole at the wrong angle and stumbled sideways, overcorrecting with her upper body. Her speech had deteriorated into fragmented sounds that Tashi later described as words that didn't connect and do anything he could follow. Within 2 minutes, she dropped to her knees. Eric, watching from roughly 30 feet away, noted her hands clawing at the snow. Not deliberately, but reflexively, the way a body reaches for something solid when it no longer trusts itself. She attempted to stand twice. Both times her legs failed to coordinate beneath her. Then her arms began jerking in irregular, poorly coordinated movements, consistent with severe neurological impairment. The oxygen mask had slipped off again and hung from its strap against her shoulder. In the headlamp beam, Eric described her face as dark and mottled, the color leaving it unevenly. A thin line of saliva had frozen at the corner of her mouth. She continued to move without coordinated control. No cry, no call, just the wind in her limbs moving against the snow. Doria reached her in roughly 90 seconds and attempted to reseat the mask and hold it against her face, but she was already unresponsive. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular intervals, each one further apart than the last, difficult to detect in the wind. She fell forward, face first into the snow, still gripping her trekking pole so tightly that her knuckles remained locked around the grip. As she stopped moving entirely, she was already dead. The post-expedition medical review identified the cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema with concurrent high-altitude pulmonary edema, brain swelling and fluid accumulation in the lungs, progressing simultaneously in an environment where intervention was not possible. Her family filed a formal complaint against the guiding company in the months that followed, citing inadequate supervision. The lead guide provided documentation of 3 separate written advisories issued to Laurie during the expedition, each recommending she halt or delay progression. The complaint was not upheld. I can look at every piece of documented evidence in this case and reach only one conclusion. The guides did their job. What they could not do was make her listen. It was April 15, 2015, on the slopes of Mount Everest. The morning sun stretched across the Khumbu icefall as climbers prepared to move higher, stepping carefully through shifting ice and narrow ladders. Even early in the day, the conditions felt unstable and every movement required focus. Mimosa Maktoum, 44, worked as a luxury real estate agent in Manhattan. Her climbing experience was limited to a few guided trips, but she approached Everest with strong confidence. After months of preparation and a costly expedition, she treated the climb as something she had earned rather than something she needed to adapt to. From early on, she focused heavily on documenting the journey, making it clear that reaching the summit with photos mattered to her. As the team moved higher, guides emphasized the importance of reducing weight. At extreme altitude, even small increases in load can slow movement and increase risk. Sherpas carried carefully measured gear, balancing what was needed for survival with what they could physically manage. Every item had a purpose, and anything extra could become a problem later. Mimosa pushed back against those limits. She insisted her Sherpa carry additional personal items, including camera equipment, extra clothing, and non-essential supplies. The added weight went beyond what was recommended. When concerns were raised, she dismissed them and continued with her plan. On summit push day, the team left Camp 4 in the early hours, entering the death zone where oxygen levels are critically low. At first, progress was steady, but it didn't take long for the added weight to slow things down. Her Sherpa began falling behind, breathing harder and struggling to keep pace. Other team members offered to redistribute the load, but she refused. She wanted everything kept with her, and the climb continued at a slower pace because of it. By early morning, it was clear they were behind schedule. At that altitude, timing matters. Weather windows are short, and delays increase exposure to risk. As they continued upward, winds began to pick up, and visibility started to drop. As they approached higher sections, the weather deteriorated quickly. Winds strengthened, and temperatures dropped sharply. Other teams began turning back. Mimosa's team was still exposed, still climbing, and now dealing with fatigue and worsening weather. Her Sherpa eventually reached a point where he could not continue. The added load and altitude had taken too much out of him, and he collapsed on the route. At that moment, the expedition leader called for an immediate descent. Mimosa resisted. She argued she had come too far to turn back. The discussion took time, and in that environment, even a few minutes matter. By the time she agreed to descend, the storm had fully arrived. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the team struggled to move safely. Temperatures fell to extreme levels, and every step became harder. They were forced to stop on a narrow section of the mountain, exposed to wind and cold, with no proper shelter. This was where everything caught up at once. The delay, the added weight, and the worsening weather left them with little chance to recover. They remained exposed through the night, using up oxygen and energy while trying to stay alive. Without shelter and with limited supplies, their bodies began to shut down under the stress of altitude and cold. By morning, Mimosa could no longer continue. She had become too weak to move, and the effects of exposure had taken over. At some point during the night or early morning, she lost her footing and fell from the narrow ledge where they had stopped. Rescue teams later found her body about 200 feet below. The cause of death was ruled as severe hypothermia and exhaustion, with contributing altitude effects. The prolonged exposure, combined with earlier delays, left her body unable to recover. It was July 28, 2016, on the upper face of K2 in northern Pakistan, at 26,200 feet above sea level, a place that has taken more lives per summit attempt than almost any other mountain on Earth. Maris Cho was a 29-year-old content creator on TikTok from Alberta, Canada. The previous year she had summited Everest via a fully guided commercial expedition, and with the way the story went, I think that achievement had changed how she understood her own ceiling. She had since built her TikTok around it, posting gear shots and summit photographs. And K2 was the next planned step in a progression she had mapped on her own terms. What she had not mapped was the technical gap between a commercially managed Himalayan route and a mountain with inconsistent fixed infrastructure and no tolerance for improvisation. I think the Everest summit genuinely convinced her she had crossed into a category of climber she had not yet reached. That is not a character flaw. K2 simply does not negotiate on that point. Her guide had flagged her ascender technique on lower sections earlier in the day. She consistently seated the device at an angle rather than fully engaging the cam against the rope. She adjusted briefly each time and continued upward without resolving the underlying habit. At a rest stop below the bottleneck, she filmed a short clip from an exposed position with the valley floor thousands of feet below, unclipping briefly from one line while repositioning to the next, fixed segment before reattaching. A nearby climber later told investigators it was the kind of casual behavior that made experienced alpinists uneasy. The guide warned her specifically about the bottleneck's transition sequence before she entered. Non-continuous fixed lines requiring independent clip management on near vertical ice. She acknowledged him and proceeded. The bottleneck is a narrow couloir pressed between K2's upper shoulder and a Sirac band that releases ice with no warning onto everything below. A climber 30 feet below Maris on the slope noticed her clip her ascender to the line at an angle, the cam not fully seated, before she weighted it and began moving upward. Her crampons were not biting consistently. He described her left foot skating slightly before catching. She jerked downward once as her weight shifted unevenly. Instead of stopping to reset the device, she pushed upward again, immediately. Her crampon failed to bite on the next step. She swung outward from the slope, and the ascender slipped down the rope as the cam failed to bite under load. The climber below watched her. Reach for the rope with both gloved hands. She could not hold it. A second fixed line ran approximately 2 feet to her left, and to my surprise, she was not clipped into it. She began sliding. Witnesses described the first few seconds as almost slow, as if she might still catch something. Then the angle of the slope took over. She struck a rock outcrop in the midsection of the couloir, which rotated her body and continued downward with repeated contact against ice and exposed rock. The sounds carried clearly to climbers still on the fixed lines above. Those lower on the route pressed flat against the ice as she passed. Her helmet came off somewhere in the lower visible portion of the couloir. Beyond a steep rollover at the base, she was gone. I have looked at photographs of that section of the mountain many times since researching this. There is nothing soft about it. There is nowhere to stop. A climber on the fixed line radioed base camp within minutes. A descent team attempted visual confirmation within 2 hours, but the terrain configuration and continued Serac hazard above made access to the fall zone impossible. No recovery was attempted. Medical findings reconstructed from the fall path and last confirmed point of contact indicated fatal blunt force trauma to the skull and thoracic cavity, consistent with multiple high-velocity impacts against ice and rock during an uncontrolled descent of several hundred vertical feet. No equipment malfunction was identified. The ascender functioned correctly under proper use. In the months that followed, her family submitted formal removal requests to the platform hosting her account. Reposts were taken down. The account was memorialized for a time, then removed entirely. I keep thinking about the clip she filmed from that exposed rest stop below the bottleneck. Gloves on, harness visible, the drop behind her not fully registering in frame. She had built genuine confidence on a foundation that looked solid from the outside, and no one had made the difference between Everest and K to feel real to her before that morning. That distinction cost her everything, and it is worth being honest about that, even if it changes nothing now. It was May 23, 2018, on the upper flanks of a peak in the Khumbu region of Nepal, where the summit ridge sits above 27,000 feet, and the atmosphere holds roughly 1/3 the oxygen available at sea level. A place where the human body does not survive so much as it slowly stops functioning. Denise Caro was 41 years old and worked as a structural engineer for a mid-size infrastructure firm based in Portland, Oregon. She had spent 11 years assembling what looked like a strong mountaineering resume on paper, but much of it consisted of guided climbs where she leaned heavily on others while presenting herself as the most knowledgeable person in the group. She frequently argued with guides, questioned route decisions, and dismissed safety briefings as overly cautious. However, I do think that she was not reckless in her own mind. She simply believed she knew better than everyone else. Her colleagues described her as someone who triple-checked load calculations and kept a laminated checklist taped to her desk. And she carried that same attitude onto the mountain, correcting others and inserting herself into decisions she wasn't qualified to make. She had trained for this specific climb for 3 years. Altitude acclimatization rotations, supplemental oxygen drills, and 2 preparatory Himalayan expeditions in prior seasons, both of which included documented disagreements with guides over pacing and oxygen use. Her stated turnaround time was 2 p.m., the hard cutoff enforced by most experienced guides operating at extreme altitude. What investigators would later piece together is that she summited at approximately 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes ahead of the cutoff. That detail matters. It likely gave her a sense of margin she did not actually have. Descending climbers who passed her reported she was moving efficiently on the way up, but had lingered near the top longer than expected, resting, adjusting gear. By the time she turned around, it was past 2:30 p.m. Her supplemental oxygen canister, based on the flow rate logged by her guide team at base camp, had less than 90 minutes of supply remaining. Above 26,000 feet, what climbers refer to as the death zone, the human body cannot acclimatize. Cells begin dying faster than they regenerate. Cognitive function degrades within hours. Coordination, judgment, and fine motor. Control collapse in sequence, often before the person experiencing the decline is aware of it. Wind on the upper ridge that afternoon was measured at roughly 35 miles per hour with gusts near 50. Air temperature had dropped to approximately minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing it closer to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. At that altitude, muscles fail under exertion that would be trivial at sea level, and the brain begins making calculations it is no longer capable of completing correctly. At approximately 3:10 p.m., a descending rope team spotted Denise near the upper ridge. A climber named Haruki, part of a separate expedition, later gave a detailed account to investigators. He described her pace as reduced to small, dragging steps, crampons scraping rather than planting, her upper body pitching forward with each movement. She was not stopping to rest. She was simply unable to move faster. Haruki said her oxygen mask was still on, but the canister gauge, visible from several meters away, appeared to read empty. By 4 p.m., she had descended less than 300 feet from where the rope team first spotted her. Then, she went down. Haruki described her collapsing sideways against the slope, not falling, but folding. One knee first, then her hip, then her shoulder. She tried to push herself upright repeatedly, arms shaking violently with the effort. And each time she reached a partial upright position, she came back down. Her breathing had become audible from several meters away, a high-pitched wheeze carried on the wind, a sound Haruki said he had not heard from a person before. Her oxygen ran out completely sometime around 4:15 p.m. Without supplemental flow, deterioration accelerated. Frost began forming along the edges of her goggles and across her eyelashes, as well as on her eyebrows and the hair visible beneath her helmet. Her skin, exposed at the jaw and chin, had taken on a grayish, waxy tone that Haruki noted explicitly in his account. I've read a lot of accounts like this, and the image of frost forming over someone's eyes while they're still technically alive is something that doesn't leave you. Her eyes remained partially open. Haruki attempted to connect his own oxygen line to her mask, but her responsiveness had already faded to the point where she could not grip or assist the connection. She settled into a semi-curled position on the slope, one hand still gripping the webbing of her harness. Her breathing slowed to shallow, irregular intervals. Then it stopped. Haruki radioed base camp at approximately 4:40 p.m. A rescue team from the expedition's high camp attempted to reach her position, but was turned back by deteriorating wind conditions. They reached her body the following morning. The coroner's report, translated and summarized for the family, listed the cause of death as hypoxic respiratory failure compounded by hypothermia, with contributing factors including physical exhaustion and altitude-induced cognitive impairment. No equipment malfunction was identified. Everything functioned as designed. She simply ran out of time and oxygen in that order. Denise Carreau's body was recovered 2 days later and transported to base camp. Her family declined a public memorial. Haruki gave his full account to investigators and has not spoken publicly since. Climbers who crossed her path remembered the same pattern: confidence that bordered on entitlement, a refusal to follow guidance, and a tendency to treat safety limits as optional. The 45 minutes she spent at the summit were not an accident. They were a decision shaped by that mindset. At that altitude, that difference is fatal. It was October 8, 2017, on the north face of Mount Everest, nearing the second step at 28,300 feet. The pre-monsoon season was ending, and only the most experienced teams remained. Conditions were unpredictable, and every step required focus. Charlotte Hopkins, 46, a wellness influencer from Malibu, had built her brand around intuitive living and body wisdom. She had documented months of preparation for Everest, insisting her holistic approach would give her an edge. Her goal was to summit while keeping her natural lifestyle principles intact, proving her philosophy could guide her safely to the top. Above 26,000 feet, supplemental oxygen is critical. The brain needs a constant flow to stay sharp. Even small drops in oxygen can cause confusion, poor judgment, and unsteady movement. Oxygen systems are calibrated for precise flow and conservation, and any modification can be deadly. Base Camp had warned repeatedly not to tamper with equipment. Her guide explained that modifying the mask or regulator could be fatal. Hopkins continued to complain about the mask feeling restrictive and began adjusting it for comfort, loosening straps and changing the flow rate. At first, she reported feeling more comfortable, but in reality, she was receiving far less oxygen than indicated, and the subtle deficit began to take its toll immediately. It's crazy how easy it is to think you're fine even when your body is already in trouble. I imagine how scary that would feel. As she climbed higher, the effects of insufficient oxygen gradually impaired her coordination and decision-making. By 28,000 feet, her movements became uneven and awkward, and her speech over the radio grew slurred. Her guide observed these changes and attempted to intervene, urging her to check her oxygen system and follow proper protocols. Hopkins ignored the warnings, insisting that she could manage the climb and that the adjustments improved her performance. The extreme altitude amplified every small error. Hopkins repeatedly removed her gloves, exposing her hands to the frigid air, where temperatures had dropped well below zero. This behavior further increased the risk of frostbite and hypothermia, both common at this elevation. Each minor choice, altering the mask, ignoring guidance, exposing herself to the cold, added cumulative strain on her body, transforming the climb into an increasingly dangerous endeavor. The compromised oxygen system continued to deteriorate as she ascended. At elevations above 28,000 feet, even a brief lapse in judgment or a minor equipment failure can become life-threatening. By 28,200 feet, the mask and regulator were no longer delivering sufficient oxygen. Hopkins collapsed suddenly, unable to maintain her balance or continue upward movement. Her guide immediately attached her to his backup system and radioed for emergency evacuation, coordinating with other team members to secure her safely for descent. Despite the rapid response, the effects of prolonged oxygen deprivation had already caused irreversible physiological damage. Her brain and body had suffered from severe hypoxia over several hours. She remained unconscious throughout the descent, with her guide and support team performing all possible interventions to maintain her condition during the hazardous trip back to Camp 4. Upon arrival at Camp 4, medical personnel confirmed that she could not be revived. The coroner later determined that severe cerebral hypoxia caused by inadequate oxygen delivery was the direct cause of death. The incident prompted immediate reviews of oxygen equipment procedures and the implementation of mandatory inspections at every camp. The incident prompted new safety protocols requiring equipment inspections at every camp. The tragedy highlighted the critical importance of following established procedures, maintaining properly functioning life support equipment, and adhering to safety protocols at extreme altitude. Charlotte Hopkins' climb serves as a stark reminder that even experienced climbers can face fatal consequences if equipment is altered and fundamental rules are ignored. On the morning of December 3, 2019, a 31-year-old project coordinator from Boise, Idaho named Brecken Olo arrived at Everest Base Camp. He carried a 65-liter mountaineering backpack 2 oxygen bottles, and no climbing partners. He was almost the only person there. Base camp in December is empty. During the spring season, this moraine at 17,600 feet becomes a temporary village of more than 200 tents, with climbers and high-altitude guides moving between rotations. By late May, the camp is dismantled, leaving bare rock. 4 months later, the Khumbu Glacier sits silent under constant wind, with no other people present. Brecken Olo pitched his tent, took a photo of himself, and posted it to social media. His mountaineering experience consisted of 3 recreational camping trips, a Via Ferrata course in Slovenia, booked through a discount activity site, and a guided attempt on Mount Rainier in 2018 that ended at 12,500 feet due to altitude sickness. Rainier's summit is 14,411 feet. Everest's is 29,032 feet. The difference between 12,500 feet and the summit, 16,532 feet, cannot be closed by determination alone. It includes altitude zones where the body cannot recover from exertion, where each night causes cellular damage, and where survival without acclimatization or supplemental oxygen approaches zero. According to friends, he had been planning the Everest trip for approximately 3 months, beginning shortly after the end of a 2-year relationship. In the weeks that followed the breakup, they said that he told them he encountered a horoscope that advised its readers to reach new heights. He booked a flight to Kathmandu. In the 3 months between that decision and his arrival at base camp, he did not hire a guide service, did not complete any high-altitude acclimatization climb, did not consult with a high-altitude medicine specialist, and did not seek guidance from any organization with expertise in Himalayan mountaineering. He researched the route using public websites and the spring season photographs of other climbers. 3 months, a breakup, and a horoscope. Would any of that matter at 29,000 feet? On the approach to base camp, Brecken Olo stopped in the village of Namche Bazaar at 11,286 feet. The standard acclimatization protocol recommended by every major expedition guide service and the majority of high-altitude medicine literature advises climbers to spend a minimum of 2 nights at Namche to allow the body to begin adjusting to the reduced oxygen availability. Brecken Olo spent 1 night. He told the owner of the tea house where he was staying about the plan. The tea house owner did not respond for several seconds before continuing to pour his tea. Mount Everest has a defined climbing season for most of the year. The jet stream sits over the Himalayas, producing summit winds that make survival on the upper mountain nearly impossible. In May, a brief weather window forms as the jet stream lifts. Temperatures may reach about -22 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds drop enough for experienced climbers using fixed ropes, guides, and oxygen to attempt a summit. By December, the jet stream has returned. Winds regularly exceed 125 miles per hour, and wind chill can reach around -76 degrees Fahrenheit. In these conditions, exposed skin can freeze in under a minute. Breathing becomes extremely difficult without oxygen, and the body operates near its physiological limit. Only 10 winter ascents of Everest had been recorded, all by elite expeditions with decades of Himalayan experience, established high camps, and carefully planned oxygen supplies. The most recent involved a team of 10 veteran climbers with extensive 8,000er experience and full expedition support. 10 ascents in total, by the best climbers in the world, with every advantage. Brecken Olo had a fraction of that. Did he know the numbers? Brecken Olo had 2 oxygen bottles. A standard summit attempt on Everest requires between 15 and 20. He had no high camps, no tent caches at Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3, or Camp 4, the established staging points on the route that allow climbers to break the ascent into manageable increments while their bodies adapt. He had no fixed ropes through the icefall or above it. He had no icefall doctors, the team of specialists paid to install and maintain the infrastructure through the Khumbu icefall each spring, who had not set foot on the mountain since May. He had no permit for a summit attempt, having filed paperwork listing his objective as a base camp trek with high-altitude exploration. He had one support person, a 24-year-old porter named Kipa, who had never been above base camp and had no high-altitude rescue training. At Everest's summit elevation in December, a human body without supplemental oxygen loses cognitive function within minutes. Without fixed ropes, there is no anchor in a fall. Without high camps, there is no shelter if weather turns. Without the icefall doctor's infrastructure, the glacier route below is unmarked and unprotected. The absence of any one of these makes a summit attempt extremely dangerous. The absence of all of them in winter by a climber whose experience ended at 12,500 feet is not a mountaineering challenge. It is a terminal situation above base camp. None of this had been disclosed to Nepalese authorities in a manner that triggered intervention before his arrival. Kipa was from a village near Phaplu in the Solukhumbu region. He was 24 years old and had carried loads to Everest Base Camp 3 times for spring expedition. Working as a porter, he had never been above base camp. He had never worked as a high-altitude climbing guide, had never had any formal mountaineering training, and had not been hired with the understanding that he would be expected to do anything other than carry gear. He found the work through a general travel forum posting. However, on Brecken Olo's social media accounts, Kipa was referred to as his Sherpa. The distinction matters and is not a semantic one. A Sherpa in the context of Everest expeditions is a high-altitude guide, a trained, experienced professional who has typically spent years working on 8,000er peaks, who has completed multiple guided ascents above 26,000 feet, and who understands route finding on glacial terrain, crevasse rescue technique, oxygen system management, and mountain medicine. Many experienced Sherpas have summited Everest more than a dozen times. They are among the most skilled and experienced high-altitude climbers on Earth. Kipa was a load carrier. He was 24 years old, had never been above 17,600 feet, and had agreed to carry gear to base camp. He had not agreed, trained for, or been equipped for anything involving the mountain above that point. The distinction between these two roles, as events would demonstrate, carried consequences beyond terminology. At Namche Bazaar, Brecken Olo spent a full day in his bunk with a severe headache. He attributed the headache to the altitude, treated it with ibuprofen and a Red Bull energy drink he had carried from the airport town of Lukla, and waited for the symptoms to pass before continuing. A severe altitude headache at 11,000 feet, less than halfway to base camp. What would his body do at twice that elevation? A trekking guide staying at the same lodge overheard a conversation about the plan and intervened. The guide was a professional with multiple seasons of Himalayan work and direct knowledge of conditions on the Khumbu. He listed the specific conditions Brecken Olo would encounter. No fixed ropes through the icefall, no icefall doctors to install them, no high-altitude support team above base camp, no acclimatization history sufficient for the elevation involved, and no oxygen supply adequate for a summit attempt. The guide noted that the 2 oxygen bottles Brecken Olo carried were designed for emergency use by acclimatized climbers at high altitude and were not a substitute for the supply chain required for a summit push. At base camp, Brecken Olo's gear included a 4-season tent rated to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, 54 degrees warmer than wind chill temperatures often recorded there in December. A legitimate down suit, mountaineering boots rented in Kathmandu that were one size too large, crampons, an ice axe, and a satellite communicator he had not fully learned to operate. His oxygen regulator had a leaking valve connection. Later investigation found he had sealed it with electrical tape. At altitude, a taped regulator is not functional. The leak reduces pressure, lowers flow below therapeutic levels, and fails in extreme cold. He carried it anyway. The Khumbu Icefall is one of the most technically demanding sections of any climbing route in the world. It is a moving glacier of fractured ice, filled with towering seracs and crevasses hundreds of feet deep. Blocks the size of buildings shift and collapse without warning. Many experienced Himalayan climbers consider it the most dangerous part of the standard Everest route. During spring, the icefall doctors spend weeks installing ladders across crevasses, fixing ropes through the seracs, and marking a route that shifts as the glacier moves. Without that infrastructure, the icefall becomes an unmarked maze of unstable ice, where a single mistake can mean a crevasse, fall, serac collapse, or an uncontrollable slide. In December, none of that existed. The ladders and ropes had been removed, and the glacier had shifted in the 7 months since climbers last crossed it. New crevasses had opened where the route had once been stable. There was no marked path and no map that matched the terrain. Brecken Olo had only a photograph of a route that no longer existed. How far could that photograph take him? At 5 a.m. on December 5th, Brecken Olo entered the icefall alone, with a headlamp and a photograph of the spring route saved to his phone. Kipa stayed at base camp. Brecken Olo moved through the lower section of the icefall, using the photograph as a reference, but the terrain it depicted no longer corresponded to the terrain in front of him. After advancing approximately 1,000 feet into the icefall, he stepped onto a snow bridge spanning a crevasse. The bridge deflected slightly under his weight, a warning sign that the snow was not adequately bonded to the ice below it, that it might not hold. He looked down into the crevasse and retreated back to base camp. telling Keepa what he did and seen. Breckenolo spent the next 4 days at base camp without ascending or descending. The cold at 17,600 feet in December burns through camping fuel faster than the packaging rates indicate. The chemical reaction that produces heat in compressed fuel canisters is less efficient at extreme cold and low atmospheric pressure, and the body requires more heated liquid and food to maintain core temperature at altitude than at sea level. By the 7th day, hot meals were being rationed. By the 8th day, Keepa told Breckenolo that he wanted to descend. Keepa's equipment was not rated for extended winter camping at base camp elevation. He had been equipped for a load camp, not for a multi-week stationary camp. His sleeping bag's temperature rating was inadequate for sustained nights in the -20s and below, and the limited insulation in his jacket was designed for exertion, not for sitting still in a wind that did not stop. His job description had been to carry loads, not to serve as a stationary support presence through an open-ended winter stay on a glacier. He had not been paid for this and had not agreed to it. Breckenolo offered him a financial bonus to stay. This made Keepa agree to remain for 1 more day. On the 9th day, a frostbite blister developed on Breckenolo's left little toe. He photographed it and posted the image to his social media account with a caption describing it as a badge of honor. Frostbite on day 9, still at base camp, before a single serious climbing attempt. What would his feet look like on day 20? Frostbite on the extremities is the first clinical indicator of a body beginning to prioritize its core temperature over its periphery, the circulatory system constricting blood flow to the fingers and toes in order to maintain warmth around the vital organ. At temperatures below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, this process accelerates. Tissue that has been frostbitten once is more susceptible to re-injury than tissue that has not. A frostbite blister on day 9 of an expedition, with no fixed ropes, no adequate oxygen supply, no qualified support, a leaking oxygen regulator sealed with electrical tape, and no realistic path to any summit, is not an accomplishment. On the morning of December 11th, Breckenolo entered the Khumbu icefall for the 2nd time. The temperature at base camp was -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusts were reaching 37 miles per hour. The wind chill at that elevation in those conditions places the effective temperature below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, the point at which Fahrenheit and Celsius scales converge, and a threshold at which exposed skin can experience frostbite in under 5 minutes. He had an existing frostbite injury on his left foot. He was wearing boots 1 size too large. Keepa did not follow him. He watched from the camp. This time, Breckenolo moved with more deliberateness than his first attempt. He tested snow bridges before committing his weight to them, probing with his ice axe to assess whether the snow was bonded to the ice below. He moved carefully through the lower Serac field, picking routes around obstacles rather than committing to the first path that appeared viable. The photograph from May was still on his phone, and he consulted it as he moved, though much of what it depicted no longer matched the terrain in front of him. The glacier had shifted. New fracture lines crossed the old path. He navigated by what looked passable. He climbed steadily. By mid-morning, he had advanced approximately 2,600 feet into the icefall, past the point where the first attempt had ended, and had reached a section of the route where a crevasse blocked forward progress. The crevasse was open, with walls of blue-green glacial ice dropping an indeterminate distance below. No snow bridge spanned it. The crossing required a jump of approximately 4 feet from a stable ice platform on one side to a similar formation on the other. During the spring season, the icefall doctors would have bridged this crossing with aluminum extension ladders laid flat across the gap, anchored with ice screws on both sides, with fixed ropes above for balance. A climber crossing on a ladder bridge is protected. The ladder catches a misplaced foot. The rope catches a stumble. In December, there was no bridge and no ropes. The crossing was a jump from one footing to another, over a drop of unknown depth. Every climber who had ever crossed this point before him had done it with a ladder underfoot and a rope overhead. He had neither. What would catching a stumble look like with nothing above him? Breckenolo jumped. 2 Nepalese climbers conducting a private winter acclimatization exercise on the lower flanks of Nuptse, the peak adjacent to Everest, were on a ridge approximately 1,300 feet away from the icefall when they spotted a figure in a red down suit moving through the ice below. The senior climber retrieved a pair of binoculars and watched. He saw the figure slow at the crevasse, pause, and jump. Breckenolo's right crampon did not engage correctly on land. The crampon, a steel frame designed to fit snugly against the sole and welt of a mountaineering boot, with front points that project forward to bite into ice on steep terrain, was mounted on a boot 1 size too large. On landing, the boot shifted inside the crampon bind. The front points that should have caught the far lip of the crevasse skidded instead of engaging. He did not fall into the crevasse. He fell beside it, onto a 35-degree ice slope with no fixed line above him and no anchored rope to arrest the fall. He swung his ice axe. The self-arrest technique, the process of driving the pick of the axe into the ice surface to stop a sliding body, requires correct body positioning at the moment of deployment, sufficient upper body strength to hold the axe shaft against the centrifugal force of an accelerating body, and a surface that the pick can penetrate. The technique is practiced on snow slopes, where the pick sinks in. According to his social media, Brecken Olo had practiced self-arrest once on a gentle snow slope during his Via Ferrata course in Slovenia. The surface beneath him was hard glacial blue ice. The axe spike dragged without catching. His body angle was wrong. He was accelerating. He slid approximately 80 feet and hit a lateral Sirac formation left side first, at full speed, after 80 feet of uncontrolled acceleration on a 35-degree ice slope. The Serac is a block of glacial ice the size of a small building. It does not give. The two climbers watching from Nuptsi, 1,300 feet away through binoculars, heard the impact from where they stood. Brecken Olo did not move after hitting it. He did not get up. He did not call out. The two Nuptsi climbers began looking for a descent route. They were more than a quarter-mile away and would not reach him for several hours. At base camp, Kepa had a line of sight to the lower icefall, but not to the section where the accident occurred. He waited. When Brecken Olo had not returned by 1 p.m., Kepa entered the icefall alone and followed the boot track. The terrain between base camp and the accident site took roughly 45 minutes to navigate. He found Brecken Olo propped against the Serac in the exact position he had landed. He had not moved in the hours since impact, had not crawled, had not repositioned. He was conscious. He could not answer questions. His left arm was deformed between the elbow and shoulder at an angle that does not occur in an intact limb. He was alive, but could not function. Kepa had no radio. The satellite communicator in Brecken Olo's jacket pocket could not be unlocked. The device required a passcode or PIN that Kepa did not know, and Brecken Olo, in his current neurological state, could not provide. Getting a conscious but unresponsive man out of the Khumbu icefall in December, alone, without radio communication, at 18,400 feet, is not a task that appears in any mountaineering rescue manual as a realistic operation for a single person with no specialized training. Kepa did it over the course of 4 hours. He weighed 128 pounds. He was not a trained mountain rescue professional. He was a 24-year-old porter who had agreed to carry gear to base camp, working at an elevation he had never previously experienced for an extended period, in temperatures that had dropped further as the afternoon light began to fade. The route back through the icefall required managing Brecken Olo's weight across unstable snow bridges, past Serac formations, and down sections of broken glacial terrain where a single misstep with an incapacitated person could have sent both of them into the ice below. He fell twice on the moraine. He said that he stopped twice when he could not continue and needed to recover before moving again. In the final 650 feet leading into base camp, Brecken Olo lost consciousness entirely. Kepa dragged him the remaining distance across the ice by the fabric of his torn-down suit. They reached base camp at 5:40 p.m. The temperature was negative 26 degrees Fahrenheit and still dropping. The two Nepalese climbers from Nuptse arrived at camp approximately 30 minutes after Brecken Olo and Kepa. They had descended their acclimatization route, crossed the lower glacier on foot, and arrived at base camp carrying their own working radio. The rescue call went out at 6:15 p.m. The response from Kathmandu was immediate and unambiguous. A helicopter could not operate at 17,600 feet after dark in winter. The air density at that elevation in December is insufficient for rotor systems to generate the lift required for controlled landing, and the absence of ambient light eliminates any margin for error on the approach. Evacuation was confirmed for first light. The two Nuptse climbers divided the night into monitoring shifts and began sitting with Brecken Olo inside the tent. His condition appeared to stabilize in the early hours of the night, and then changed at approximately 2:10 a.m. His breathing became irregular, the intervals between breaths lengthening, the breaths themselves shallower, with an increasingly labored quality to each intake. The senior Nuptse climber, who had accumulated substantial high-altitude medical knowledge over years of 8,000er expeditions, recognized the breathing pattern and radioed Kathmandu with an updated assessment. He reported two concurrent suspected conditions: high-altitude pulmonary edema and possible traumatic brain injury resulting from the impact with the Serap. High-altitude pulmonary edema is a condition in which the reduced atmospheric pressure at elevation causes fluid to leak from the capillaries into the lung tissue, progressively filling the air sac and reducing the lung's ability to exchange oxygen into the bloodstream. Left untreated at altitude, it is fatal. The impact injury sustained during the fall, consistent with the fracture visible in the left arm and with the impact sound reported by the Nuptse climbers from 1,300 feet away, may have also produced internal bleeding or thoracic trauma that compounded the pulmonary crisis. The response from Kathmandu did not change. The helicopter could not move before dawn. The two Nuptse climbers administered the supplemental oxygen remaining from their own acclimatization supply. It had been calibrated for their own use at elevation during a controlled exercise, not for emergency medical support of a critically ill patient through a winter night. The supply extended into the early morning hours, but it was finite. By 4 a.m., Brecken Olo was unresponsive to both voice and physical stimulus. His lips had turned cyanotic, the blue-gray discoloration that occurs when blood oxygen saturation falls low enough that the color of deoxygenated hemoglobin becomes visible through the skin and mucous membrane. Cyanosis at this severity is a clinical sign of impending cardiorespiratory failure. At 6:40 a.m. on December 12th, approximately 70 minutes before the rescue helicopter's arrival, Brecken Olo stopped breathing. The senior Nuptse climber performed chest compressions. The second climber timed them on his watch. The compressions continued for 18 minutes, from 6:40 a.m. to 7:02 a.m., at which point they stopped. The helicopter landed at base camp at 7:50 a.m. The crew confirmed the time of death on site. Brecken Olo's body was flown to Kathmandu and subsequently repatriated to Boise, Idaho. No regulations were found to have been violated by any party involved in the expedition. No charges were filed. Keepa was interviewed once by authorities and cleared of negligence. The record showed a young porter with no rescue training had entered a crevasse field alone, found an unconscious climber, and carried him 2,600 feet across glacial terrain in winter darkness to reach camp. The Khumbu icefall reopened the following May, when the icefall doctors installed the fixed ropes and aluminum ladder bridges spring. The 2020 season was later canceled due to COVID-19, leaving the glacier empty again. In the years that followed, hundreds of climbers summited Everest annually with fixed lines, guides, oxygen, and full expedition support, while the winter record of 10 ascents remained unchanged. It was May 21st, 2017, on the southeast ridge of the world's highest peak in the Himalayan range of Nepal, where a fixed rope queue had stalled for over 40 minutes at the Hillary Step. The combination of commercial crowding, extreme altitude, and one unclipped carabiner was already in the process of becoming fatal. Maribel Kaplan was 38 and worked as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company in Houston, Texas. She had taken up mountaineering in her early 30s following a divorce, progressing through technical peaks in South America and Central Asia over 5 years. The summit had been a publicly announced goal posted on her company's internal blog 2 years prior. She paid a commercial guiding company roughly $60,000 for the permit, logistics, and summit attempt. She arrived at base camp 8 weeks earlier and completed 2 acclimatization rotations. Already frustrated with the slow pace and convinced she deserved priority, she muttered complaints under her breath, voice sharp enough that fellow climbers 2 positions away glanced over with annoyance. The former Hillary Step area, in busy season, functions less like a climbing challenge and more like a single-file bottleneck, with lethal consequences for any uncontrolled movement. The fixed ropes anchored along its face are the only barrier between a climber and a drop of several thousand feet off the exposed ridge. At roughly 28,700 feet, the human body operates on a fraction of sea level oxygen, and the impairment to both judgment and fine motor, coordination is measurable and well documented. On this particular morning, 11 climbers were compressed onto terrain that comfortably accommodates 3. Temperature sat near negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained winds of 30 miles per hour. By 6:10 a.m., Maribel had been stationary on the ledge for nearly 45 minutes. By now, her impatience had escalated into open irritation. She jabbed her ice axe against the ledge, huffing audibly and glaring at climbers ahead of her, occasionally snapping at the guide to move faster. Stefan Brauer, a 44-year-old German climber with 2 prior Himalayan summits, was positioned roughly 6 feet above her on the fixed rope. Below her, a Nepali high-altitude guide named Nima Sherpa was managing the group's spacing. The ledge at that section was barely 2 feet wide, ice-coated rock with a clean vertical drop on the downhill side. At approximately 6:15 a.m., the queue stalled again. Maribel unclipped from the fixed rope. Stefan, looking down at that moment, called out for her to stop. She moved sideways regardless, attempting to pass 2 climbers directly above her. Personally, I think exhaustion stops being a background detail at this exact moment and becomes the actual cause of everything that follows. Her crampons scraped audibly against the mixed ice and granite surface as she shifted her weight laterally. One crampon failed to bite. Her left foot swung outward and found no purchase. The slip was immediate. Her arms came out to both sides, no rope within reach, no surface to catch against. She fell backward between 30 and 40 feet and struck an exposed rock outcrop head first before coming to rest on a sloped ice shelf below. The impact was visible to at least 3 climbers above. Her helmet split along the right side on contact. Blood spread across the ice beneath her head within seconds. Her body moved once, a single involuntary contraction, then went completely still. Stefan called out. A second climber above him immediately began calling down to Nima. Nima reached her within minutes. He found no breathing and severe cranial trauma visible beneath the fractured edge of her helmet. Given the extent of visible injuries and the altitude, no resuscitation attempt was considered viable. I find it hard not to think about what happens if she simply stays clipped to that rope for another 10 minutes. That thought doesn't go anywhere, but it doesn't leave either. She was confirmed dead before any medical team reached her. The report concluded death occurred at the scene. Maribel's company posted a tribute on their internal platform 2 days after news reached Houston. The summit photograph she had promised to share with her team was never taken. What I keep returning to is that the guiding company's post-season incident documentation categorized this under client decision. And the framing, more than anything else in this story, is the most honest thing they probably ever said about how commercial high-altitude operations actually work. It was May 22, 2016, in the infamous death zone above 26,000 feet on Mount Everest. Climbers moved slowly through the Hillary Step, a nearly vertical 40-foot rock face where fixed ropes guide, passage across narrow, exposed ledges. At that altitude, every minute burns precious oxygen, and a single misstep can be fatal. Yachi Timsinia, 38, a corporate lawyer from Chicago, approached the climb with the same intensity she brought to the courtroom. She had summited Denali and Aconcagua, and Everest was meant to be her ultimate achievement. Her focus on personal accomplishment and being first in line drove her decisions more than judgment or experience. The Hillary Step is one of the deadliest bottlenecks on the mountain. Climbers must ascend single file, yielding to descending teams, and carefully coordinate movements. Even small delays burn precious oxygen, and every minute spent stationary increases the risk of altitude sickness. At this altitude, cognitive function deteriorates and reaction time slows. Mistakes that might be minor lower down can be fatal here. I noticed how every climber around her was operating on a razor's edge, and any disruption would ripple across the group. Timsina quickly became frustrated when she found herself behind a slower-moving team. It felt like impatience rather than concern for safety guided her actions. She demanded the team move faster, disregarding the fact that the ledges were too narrow to pass safely. Her competitive nature seemed to cloud judgment, and it became clear that she prioritized her ego over established protocols. At a critical point, halfway up the Hillary Step, she attempted to climb around the slower climbers. She detached from her safety line to reposition herself, a decision that struck me as reckless even before the fall. Every choice requires full attention and respect for the environment, and any deviation can have fatal consequences. The other climbers were visibly tense, aware that a misstep could end in disaster for anyone nearby. A sudden gust of wind struck as she transferred her weight. Without the safety line attached, she lost balance and fell backward. Her body tumbled down the rock face, striking jagged outcroppings before disappearing from view. Rescue teams located her body 3 days later, roughly 800 feet below the Hillary Step. The coroner ruled massive trauma as the cause of death, with contributing factors of altitude sickness and impaired judgment. Her oxygen tank was nearly full, showing that she had been adequately prepared and equipped. Her death was not a lack of resources, but a result of decisions made in defiance of experience and caution. The incident made climbing journals and forums note the dangers of ignoring protocols, and the climbers who witnessed her fall emphasized patience and teamwork as essential for survival. Tim Sina's law firm issued a brief statement about her adventurous spirit and declined further comment. The German climber she tried to bypass completed his summit and later started a foundation focused on mountain safety. Her choices highlight the consequences of prioritizing personal ambition over collective safety. The mountain does not negotiate or bend to desire. Tim Sina's competitive instincts, impatience, and belief that rules could be bypassed ultimately prove fatal. It is a sobering reminder that on Everest, survival depends on discipline and situational awareness, and even the most confident individual can be undone by the environment when ego takes the lead. It was April 18, 2015, on a narrow shelf above Camp 2 in the Annapurna region of Nepal, where the upper snowfields hold their shape for weeks and then release all of it in under a minute. And the difference between those two states is invisible until it is not. Tessa Michaels was 24 years old, from Auckland, New Zealand. She had worked retail for 3 years before taking a year off to travel through Southeast Asia and into the Himalayas. She had a modest but growing TikTok following built around what she called hidden camp spots, locations chosen for their visual payoff, photographed at the best light, framed for the best angle. She was not a technical mountaineer. She had joined a guided group to reach Camp 2, and by all accounts, she was enthusiastic. Unfortunately for her, enthusiasm doesn't do much in one of the world's deadliest peaks. She had set her tent roughly 1,000 feet from the group's designated camp, beneath a wide-open snow face that offered an unobstructed view of the eastern horizon at sunrise. She moved her tent there after the group had already established camp, carrying part of her gear herself in 2 trips. A guide had walked to her position the previous afternoon and told her directly that the slope above was avalanche-prone, particularly as daytime temperatures rose and the snowpack cycled through freeze-thaw stress. She acknowledged what he said. However, she did not move. Imagine a direct warning from someone whose job it is to keep you alive, and you still didn't follow. The weather was clear. The snow at her feet was firm. From where she stood, nothing looked wrong. She filmed the sunset from that position. She was still there at first light, but overnight temperatures had fluctuated, and the upper snowpack, loosened by the previous day's warmth and refrozen unevenly, had entered a condition experienced guides describe as structurally unreliable, a slab resting on a weakened layer beneath it, waiting for a trigger that might arrive or might not. The upper face above her tent stretched nearly 400 feet wide in the gray pre-dawn. A climber from the main camp, moving out early around 5:40 a.m., noticed thin, loose snow sliding off the face above her tent, the kind of minor surface movement that can mean nothing or can mean the slope is beginning to talk. He stopped to watch. Then, roughly 60 feet higher and further left across the face, a fracture line opened. It ran clean and straight across the width of the upper slope. The slab below it began to move. He shouted in her direction, but the distance was too great. The wind was carrying his voice away from her position and into the open valley. A second team member near the camp entrance also shouted. Neither warning likely reached her. The avalanche, dense, heavy spring snow mixed with compacted ice, accelerated down the open face and covered the distance to her position in well under half a minute from fracture. She had exited her tent. She was standing beside it, phone in hand, facing upslope. Both witnesses described her turning toward the sound before the flow reached her. The snow hit her at the knees and she went down immediately. The debris, moving at an estimated 30 to 40 miles per hour at impact, rolled over her in a mass that witnesses described as heavy rather than explosive. Not a wall, but a weight. Her tent collapsed. Part of it was carried downslope. Her arm was visible above the surface for a brief moment, pressing upward against the compacting snow before the settling debris covered it completely. The slope went quiet. I don't think the word buried captures what actually happens. The snow compacts immediately. It sets like concrete. The alarm was raised within seconds. The team leader called for mountain rescue and moved toward the debris field within 2 minutes. Avalanche probes and transceivers were deployed across the zone. Tessa was located after roughly 20 minutes, at a depth of about 3 feet beneath the surface. Extraction through the compacted debris took additional time. She was dead when recovered. Her pre-scheduled social media posts, clips of the campsite, the sunset, the slope she had positioned herself to film, continued uploading automatically for several hours after the avalanche. Followers left confused, cheerful comments beneath footage of the face that had killed her before teammates reported the account. The posts were eventually taken down by the platform after the incident. Exit was reported. She had every opportunity to not be in that location. The guide told her. She understood. She made a judgment based on conditions that looked stable from where she was standing. And that is an understandable decision. It is also the decision that killed her. Those two things can be true at the same time, and sitting with that is harder than anything else in this story. It was May 14th, 2016, on the balcony, a wind-scoured shelf at 27,500 feet on Everest's southeast ridge, when Talia Bren, fuming and impatient, complained loudly about the slow idiots ahead of her, tapped her crampons impatiently, and demanded everyone let her pass, a 2-minute rest turning fatal in the thin air. Talia was 38, a self-assured earth science teacher from Portland, Oregon, who believed she knew more than the guides and apparently resented anyone questioning her judgment. She had only a handful of technical climbs to her name, easy Cascades routes, a single Aconcagua summit, and 2 aborted Himalayan attempts where the guide said later that she blamed the weather rather than her lack of experience. She had never attempted a true high-altitude push without supplemental oxygen. I personally think that for her, Everest was less a goal than a trophy she felt entitled to conquer. Preparation for Talia was more about appearances than skill. She carried a pulse oximeter and logged readings obsessively, but only to prove to herself and others how capable she was. She had been vocal about summiting without supplemental oxygen, dismissing guides' warnings as unnecessary, and she openly criticized climbers who relied on bottles. On summit night, the emergency oxygen bottle was recovered from her pack, valve closed, unused, despite repeated offers from guides to help her use it. The death zone, above 26,000 feet, is a clinical designation, not a dramatic one. At that altitude, oxygen partial pressure falls to roughly 1/3 of sea level. The brain deteriorates before the body does, and in ways the person experiencing it cannot reliably detect. Judgment degrades first. A climber can report feeling sharp while visibly impaired to everyone nearby. The body compensates through faster breathing and elevated heart rate, which simultaneously drains fluid reserves and accelerates exhaustion. No acclimatization replaces what the air simply withholds. Talia reached the balcony just before 5 a.m., roughly 7 hours into her summit push with no supplemental oxygen. A Spanish climber named Dario Vela, moving just ahead of her, glanced back at her brash comments as she complained about useless Sherpas slowing progress, and ignored every caution about pacing. She swayed while seated, barely noticing the tilt. When asked how she felt, she waved him off, saying she was fine, with a tone that suggested annoyance rather than honesty. Her lips were noticeably darker than normal, but she dismissed it as a minor inconvenience. I'll be honest, that one detail told me exactly where this story was going before I even finished reading it. Within minutes, Talia stood abruptly and went still. She stared forward without fixing on anything. Her breathing became audible, uneven, labored, carrying a faint wet quality that experienced high-altitude climbers associate with fluid collecting in the lungs. She began producing fragmented phrases that neither Dario nor the Sherpa guide beside him could interpret. Her movements became uncoordinated, and she struggled to keep her balance. Then she stepped sideways and went down into the snow without bracing herself. Dario and the Sherpa, a man named Pemba, reached her immediately. Her body had gone fully slack. No resistance, no self-support. They managed to get her partially upright before her weight shifted back. Her eyes opened once, briefly, without tracking either of them. Her lips had deepened to a blue-purple visible even in low light. Pemba reached for her emergency oxygen bottle and worked the mask toward her face. Her breathing had already reduced to slow, widely, almost spaced gasps. The mask was positioned but produced no meaningful response beneath it. Frost was forming along her nostrils and across her eyelashes. The gasps continued to space further apart. Pemba radioed base camp at approximately 5:08 a.m. Given their position on the route, any response team would have required several hours to reach them under those conditions. Talia became fully unresponsive within several minutes of collapsing. Sustained manual attempts to assist her breathing produced no recovery. The expedition report later listed the presumed cause of death as hypoxic brain injury, secondary to severe high-altitude cerebral and pulmonary edema, with secondary cardiac arrest. In plain terms, the brain and lungs filled with fluid, oxygen saturation dropped below the threshold for consciousness, and the heart stopped. No traumatic injuries, equipment undamaged. The oxygen bottle in her pack was full. Her school held a service the following month. The expedition leader released a terse statement noting her choices were deliberate. Fellow climbers remembered her arrogance and refusal to heed warnings. What makes this story chilling is that Talia knew the risks, carried the tools to survive, and still dismissed them at every stage. Her final acts were not ignorance. They were the result of overconfidence and entitlement. That gap between knowing and acting, fueled by arrogance, is what ultimately killed her. It was September 14th, 2018, during the post-monsoon climbing season on Mount Everest. The mountain was experiencing unusually dry conditions, creating deceptive weather that masked the serious hydration challenges facing climbers in the death zone. Guadi Escolastico, 46, a wellness entrepreneur from Beverly Hills, had built her brand around biohacking and optimizing human performance through unconventional methods. She promoted intermittent fasting, specialized hydration protocols, and metabolic efficiency training. Her Everest expedition was meant to prove her theories, documented for a planned Netflix series on extreme wellness. At extreme altitude, the human body loses water rapidly through heavy breathing and dry air. Climbers typically need 4 to 6 liters of fluid daily, along with 5,000 to 6,000 calories, just to keep their bodies functioning. Dehydration above 26,000 feet thickens the blood, reduces oxygen transport, and impairs cognition, compounding the dangers of altitude. Medical teams at base camp had stressed strict hydration and nutrition, warm liquids every 30 minutes, high-calorie foods every hour, and avoiding low-altitude strategies were essential. Escolastico dismissed these warnings, believing her own mountain optimization protocol could handle the stress. She practiced strategic dehydration to train her kidneys and intermittent fasting to improve fat-burning efficiency, ignoring her guide's advice. From Camp 4, she immediately deviated from standard hydration practices. She drank little, claiming her body was adapted for efficiency. Warm tea and soup were declined because they didn't fit her self-imposed precision nutrition schedule. By morning near 27,000 feet, warning signs were clear. Her speech slurred, coordination faltered, and urine output dropped to almost nothing. She was showing early dehydration despite the cold. Seeing someone ignore these signs made it clear how easy it is to misread your own body. Her guide pressed her to drink, but she insisted her body was accessing stored hydration, and that stopping her protocol would hurt performance. As they climbed, her blood thickened, reducing oxygen flow to her brain and muscles. She stumbled frequently and showed confusion, but remained determined to follow her plan. By 28,000 feet, dehydration-induced altitude sickness became severe. Her heart raced, skin lost elasticity, and she experienced disorientation. She finally drank, but her body could not process fluids at that altitude, and the damage was irreversible. I couldn't help but feel scared seeing how stubborn decisions could pile up, one after another, pushing someone past the point of no return. During the final push to the summit, her severely dehydrated body gave out. She collapsed, unable to stay upright on the icy slope. Her guide quickly secured her with a safety rope and began emergency rehydration, giving small sips of electrolyte solution while monitoring her pulse and breathing. He radioed base camp for urgent evacuation, explaining her critical condition. Despite these efforts, her body continued to weaken, Her movements were sluggish, her skin pale and dry, and she became increasingly disoriented. The extreme altitude amplified the effects of dehydration, making the descent a struggle for both her and the guide. Even with help from team members, the prolonged lack of fluids had caused irreversible damage. She died at 28,400 feet from severe dehydration, acute mountain sickness, and cardiovascular failure. The coroner found her blood dangerously concentrated, essentially turning her circulatory system into sludge. Her water bottles were nearly full, proving she had deliberately avoided proper hydration. The incident was widely reported in wellness publications as a cautionary tale about applying unproven theories in extreme environments. Reading her story, it struck me how easy it is to trust ideas that feel good but aren't safe. Her final social media post, published after her death, promoted listening to your body's wisdom, advice that could have saved her. Escolastico's story shows that at extreme altitude, proper hydration, oxygen, and nutrition are critical, and ignoring them can be fatal. It was September 3rd, 2014, on the Gouda route high above the Tête Rousse Glacier in the French Alps, where the air at roughly 14,000 feet doesn't warn you. It simply collects its toll, quietly and without ceremony, from anyone who hasn't prepared to pay it. Elise Marot was 22 years old from Lyon, France. She had built a modest but growing TikTok following by documenting what she called aesthetic travel content. Short clips of herself in carefully considered outfits against dramatic backdrops. Coastal cliffs, lavender fields, limestone gorges. Mont Blanc was her next location. Her hiking experience was real, but limited to trails well below significant altitude, and she had no prior exposure to high-altitude weather systems. She seemed like someone who had not yet learned to respect a thing she had never encountered. The decision to pack light made sense within the frame she had built around the trip. Heavy insulation doesn't photograph the way thin layers do against open sky. She brought light gloves, a mid-layer fleece, and a wind shell. Each item deliberate, but each item insufficient. A morning forecast noted moderate winds with a possible temperature drop near the summit, but the language of forecasts compresses badly in the mind of someone who has never felt what those words mean at altitude. Other climbers at the overnight refuge noted her thin, insufficient gear. A guide on the route mentioned it directly to her. Apparently she acknowledged it, said she planned a quick turnaround, and yet did not change her plan. I don't think she was being dismissive. I think she genuinely didn't have the reference point to understand what she was being warned about. The Gouda route above 12,000 feet is a narrow spine of compacted snow, an exposed rock where the wind has no terrain left to break against before it reaches you. She left the refuge before dawn with a small group of independent climbers and a route guide. The early hours were manageable. By mid-morning, the wind had shifted and picked up beyond what the forecast suggested, and the temperature had dropped sharply. She stopped twice to film short clips, removing her gloves each time to operate her phone. Climbers moving past her noted she was already stopping more frequently than the pace required. By the time the group reached the upper ridge approach, she was visibly slower. A climber directly behind her later told investigators she had begun fumbling with her phone, not filming, just attempting to grip it, before it slipped from her hand into the snow. She retrieved it, but her hands did not close around it the way hands normally close. They pressed against it. The climber described her grip as flat and uncoordinated. Her speech when she responded to questions from the guide had taken on a quality he described as slightly behind, words arriving at the right intervals, but without sharpness behind them. She stumbled twice on crampon placements that should have been routine. The guide attempted to turn her around. She took several more steps upward before stopping on her own. This is the part I find hardest to process, not because it was sudden, but because it wasn't. It happened in plain view, incrementally, and the people around her were watching it unfold without the tools to stop it. What followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. She began shivering in the sustained, full-body way that signals a system working hard to compensate. Then the shivering slowed. Two climbers flanked her and began moving her back down the ridge. Her crampon placements became unreliable, each step requiring direct guidance. Within minutes of the descent beginning, she sat down in the snow and could not stand without being physically lifted. Her head dropped forward. A climber supporting her left arm described her eyes as open, but not tracking. Her responses to direct questions stopped entirely. She remained unresponsive during extraction and transport, and rescuers continued active rewarming and monitoring during the flight before she was later pronounced dead at the Valley Hospital. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be fatal hypothermia with associated cardiac arrhythmia, secondary to core temperature collapse. In the weeks after her death, short clips from her trip were shared by a small fashion-focused TikTok account. Viewers began commenting on her clothing choices, and the footage before the posts were mass-reported and removed. I've thought about that a lot. The last images of her that circulated weren't about what happened. They were about what she was wearing when it did. That feels like its own kind of cruelty, separate from the mountain entirely, and one that nobody was held accountable for. It was May 9th, 2018. Ru Achebe, 29, from Columbus, Ohio, led the group. A former collegiate wrestler, he had spent a decade building a body combining power and endurance. He had climbed Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua, 22,838 feet, and moved through the Khumbu icefall without looking down. Chodron Dorje, a veteran Sherpa guiding another team, had been observing them from base camp, expecting them to quit in the icefall. They did not, and reached Camp 1 in good order. Most teams cross the Khumbu icefall before dawn, when the glacier is slightly more stable, moving quickly to limit risk. The majority of Everest's avalanche deaths occur here. Per vertical foot gained, it is the most dangerous section on the mountain. Davin Selk, 31, from Bozeman, Montana, was a wildfire smoke jumper accustomed to low oxygen, high altitude conditions, though the death zone at 26,247 feet far exceeds typical wildfire altitudes of 5,000 to 11,000 feet. Could even his hard-earned lung capacity withstand the thin air above 26,000 feet? Thomas Veln, 34, from Flagstaff, Arizona, a structural engineer, had planned the climb over 3 years, analyzing every successful no-oxygen Everest ascent since Messner and Habeler in 1978. He tracked pace, acclimatization, weather, and physiological demands, and had previously turned back at Camp 3 twice due to bad weather. The forecast for this season's summit window was the clearest he had ever seen. He believed, based on everything he had read and calculated, that it was possible. Above the icefall, the terrain flattens into a wide glacier valley called the Western CWM. The valley walls rise steeply on either side, and the flat floor of it creates a kind of solar oven. The snow reflects and concentrates sunlight until temperatures swing from -20 degrees Fahrenheit at night to 40 degrees above zero during the day. Exposed skin burns here even when the air feels cold. The light is blinding without the right eyewear. It is beautiful and deeply strange, a place that looks peaceful from photographs and feels hostile in person. It was during the team's first rotation through Camp 1 that Chodron noticed Ru moving unsteadily between tents. An unsteady gait at 19,900 feet is not by itself cause for alarm. The body is adjusting to altitude, and clumsiness and mild disorientation are normal early symptoms of that adjustment. Chodron noted it. He said nothing to Ru. He had his own clients to look after, and he had not been hired to manage 3 independent climbers who had made their own decisions about their own approach. The question of what his responsibility was to them, if any, would sit with him for a long time after the mountain. Would ignoring these early warning signs come back to haunt them? At Camp 2, at 21,300 feet, Chodron did something he would later describe as the closest thing to intervention that he managed. He sat down and shared a meal with the 3 men. The conversation was direct. He asked whether any oxygen was cached higher on the route, at Camp 3 or Camp 4, held back as an emergency reserve. They said no. He asked whether any of them had been above 23,000 feet without supplemental oxygen before. Tomas invoked Messner's name. Chodron finished eating and walked away. Reinhold Messner is best known for proving humans can survive on Everest without bottled air. His 1980 solo ascent, a product of years spent systematically pushing his acclimatization limits, remains a landmark in mountaineering. Even Messner called it traveling to the edge of human possibility. Tomas cited him as evidence. Chodron didn't argue, focused on his own team's summit push. The Lhotse face marks Everest's transition from grueling trek to extreme climb. 4,000 vertical feet of 45-degree ice, fixed ropes anchored by Sherpas, guide climbers using ascenders, one careful move at a time. At 23,000 feet, oxygen is only a third of sea level. The body adapts partially, but every step, decision, and breath reflects this deficit. Supplemental oxygen eases the strain, but without it, the challenge is constant and uncompromising. Would each calculated step be enough to stay alive on this slope? Rue began to slow visibly on the Lhotse face. Not dramatically, not in a way that might have triggered alarm from a distance, but noticeably. His pace, which had been strong in the icefall and through the CWM, started dropping on the steeper ground. By the time he and Davon reached Camp 3 at 24,500 feet, Tomas had been waiting for them for over an hour. The gap between them on the Lhotse face was the first clear, visible evidence that the three men were not performing equally. Tomas had moved the terrain most efficiently, his engineering mind perhaps translating pace targets into a mechanical problem to be executed. He had also just reached the highest altitude he had ever achieved on this mountain. Both of his previous climbs had stopped below this point. Whatever he had been planning for 3 years, he was standing in new territory now. Chodron passed Rue on the Lhotse face while managing his own clients upward. He noted Rue's breathing, fast and shallow, the pattern of a body trying to compensate for thin air by breathing more frequently, pulling more air through the lungs in the hope of extracting more oxygen. It is a strategy the body deploys automatically, and it costs energy that cannot be easily replaced at altitude. Chodron noted it. He kept moving. His clients were above him, and they had a summit schedule to keep. Camp 3 is carved into a near-vertical ice shelf on the Lhotse face. Tents are anchored with ice screws drilled into the slope. There is nothing level about it. The exposure is complete to the weather, to the altitude, to the simple fact that a tent at 24,500 feet on a 45-degree ice face is not a place the human body recognizes as somewhere it should be. Objects dropped here do not stop for several thousand feet. Would the precarious camp give them any margin if a single mistake occurred? At this altitude, without supplemental oxygen, sleep is not really sleep. It is the body's attempt to rest while simultaneously trying to breathe enough to stay alive, and it cannot fully accomplish both. The condition is well documented and has a clinical description, but the experience of it is simpler. You lie down, you drift, you surface gasping, you lie down again. The cycle repeats. The morning finds you more depleted than the night before, which is the opposite of what rest is supposed to accomplish. None of the three men slept more than 90 minutes at any stretch. Chodron, whose tent was pitched directly adjacent to theirs, could hear them through the nylon wall well past midnight, talking through logistics, adjusting their summit timeline, calculating water intake, running through gear checks verbally. The conversation was organized. It was detailed. There was no audible fear in it, no sign of someone on the edge of a decision to turn back. Chodron said later that this was the detail that unsettled him the most, more than the slow pace on the Lhotse face or the unsteady gait at Camp 1. Panic would have been easier to read. Panic would have been a recognizable signal. Calm, coherent planning at 24,500 feet without oxygen, past midnight, after weeks of accumulated altitude stress, was harder to interpret. It could mean they were managing the conditions extraordinarily well. It could also mean that the altitude had already begun doing what altitude does to judgment, quietly, invisibly, from the inside. Could invisible impairment already be undermining the decisions that mattered most? Tomas, in conversation during the rest day at Camp 3, mentioned to Chodron for the first time that both of his previous retreats from the mountain had occurred near this elevation. Weather both times. The window above them, he said, was clear. He had waited for a window this clear for 3 years. The South Col, at 26,000 feet between Everest and Lhotse, is a flat, exposed plateau with no shelter. In storms, it becomes one of Earth's most hostile environments. In calm, it remains brutal. Scattered remnants of past expeditions, crushed oxygen cylinders, torn tents, abandoned gear, mark it as a place of constant aftermath. The three men rested at Camp 4 on the afternoon and evening of May 9th before their midnight departure. Around them, the other teams on the Col went through the pre-summit rituals that supplemental oxygen makes orderly. Regulator checks, flow rate settings, spare cylinder counts, mask fittings. These preparations have a methodical quality, the careful verification of the system that is keeping your brain functional at this altitude. The three men went through their own preparations without that system. They checked gear, ate what they could, drank as much water as they could heat and carry. They slept, to the extent sleeping was possible, at 26,000 feet without oxygen. Could their self-reliance survive the margin for error thinning at 26,000 feet? Chodron watched Rue leave most of his dinner uneaten. Food aversion at altitude is common and not automatically alarming. The body suppresses appetite under hypoxic stress. But combined with everything else he had noted over the previous days, it was another data point in a ledger that was not trending well. Then he watched Rue sit completely still for 15 minutes, staring at nothing in particular. This kind of vacant stillness, in someone who should be preparing mentally and physically for the most demanding night of their climbing life, was different from food aversion. It was the kind of stillness that sits at the border of shutdown. Chadran walked over. He asked Rue directly how he was feeling. Rue looked at him clearly, held eye contact, and said he was fine. Then Chadran walked back to his clients. He had asked. He had received an answer. What he could not verify was whether the person giving the answer was the same person who had led the group cleanly through the Khumbu icefall 2 weeks before, or someone already being worked on by the altitude in ways that neither of them could see. The departure was at midnight. Death zone altitude, defined as 26,247 feet and above, the elevation at which the human body cannot maintain itself, was less than 250 feet overhead. Chadran's 2 clients, flowing oxygen at the standard rate, settled into the steady, sustainable pace that supplemental air allows. The 3 men moved with what their bodies could give them in air that was less than 1/3 as oxygen-rich as the air at sea level. All 5 of them were pointed at the same place. The night was clear. The wind was manageable. The mountain, for the moment, was letting them come. Could favorable conditions be enough to overcome the invisible effects of extreme altitude? The death zone is perilous not just for cold, exposure, or physical deterioration, but because severe hypoxia distorts perception. Early to mid-stage hypoxia can create a false sense of clarity and control, while judgment quietly erodes. Climbers believe they are thinking clearly, even as they are not, making it one of Earth's most dangerous environments. As the night wore on and the teams moved higher, the gap between Chadran's oxygen-equipped clients and the 3 men widened steadily. The pace difference was not dramatic at first. Altitude slows everyone, and the route between Camp 4 and the balcony at 27,500 feet is technical enough that raw fitness matters less than it would on flat ground. But the gap grew. By the time Chadran's team reached the balcony and stopped to wait, the 3 men were 40 minutes behind. 40 minutes at this altitude is a number with specific meaning. It is not the kind of gap that closing it by pushing harder would solve. Pushing harder above 26,000 feet without oxygen means spending down reserves the body cannot replenish at this elevation, and it accelerates the timeline of deterioration. The gap meant that the 3 men were working significantly harder than the pace required, getting less efficient return on that work with every foot gained, and were still losing time. Chadran, watching them arrive at the balcony, read all of this in the way that a guide with many seasons above 26,000 feet reads a situation he has seen the beginnings of before. Could the 3 men survive the inefficiency building against them with each step? He looked at all 3 of them. Darwin's gait had changed in a way that was hard to name, but easy to see. The unconscious automatic fluidity of a trained climber's movement had been replaced by something deliberate and concentrated, each step a small project that required attention. Rue's breathing was audible from 20 feet away, a labored sound that should not have carried that clearly in air this thin. Tomas stepped forward and asked Chadran a coherent, specific question about the conditions on the route above them, the technical question of someone who was still processing information, still planning. Chadran answered it. They all continued upward together. Chadran has said since that he does not know what stopping them at the balcony would have looked like. He had no authority over them. They had not hired him. They had said they were fine. They were still moving. Chadran and his clients reached the summit at 4:50 in the morning. They spent 11 minutes at the top, enough time to confirm arrival, take photographs for the documentation that clients pay for, and assess descent conditions. Then they started down. The protocol for descent is as important as the protocol for ascent. Standing at the summit is not the achievement. Getting home is the achievement. At 5:30 in the morning, coming down through the section above the balcony, Chadran spotted 2 figures below him on the slope. One was seated, one was on hands and knees. Neither was moving in a purposeful direction. There was no third figure visible near them. Could the figures below him still have the strength to survive the final descent? He reached them at 5:52. Rue was on his hands and knees in the snow and would not stand when Chadran tried to help him up. His legs were not responding with enough strength to push his body upright. Darwin was seated against a rock with his back straight, eyes open, eyes tracking Chadran as he moved. He was not speaking. When Chadran asked where Tomas was, Darwin raised one hand and pointed upward toward the summit. Chadran looked up. 300 feet above him, one figure was still moving, still climbing, still pointed at the top of the world. Chadran shouted. The figure did not respond and did not slow. He told his 2 clients to clip their carabiners into the fixed line and not move. He radioed base camp to relay the situation and request any support that could be sent up. Base camp confirmed there was nothing available to send. Then Chadran turned around and climbed back up alone. He reached Tomas at 6:10 in the morning at 28,300 feet, roughly 700 feet below the summit, on the final steep section of the southeast ridge. What he found was something he would describe carefully and precisely in his testimony afterward. Tomas was moving with technically correct form. His crampons were placing properly on the ice. His ice axe was in his hand. His weight was distributed correctly. Everything the body had learned to do on a mountain over 12 years of climbing was still executing. His eyes were open. They were not registering anything in front of them. Could a body perfectly executing motions be trusted if the mind is absent? When Chadran stepped directly into Tomas's path, Tomas tried to walk around him, not aggressively, not as a refusal or a confrontation, simply as if the obstacle was navigational rather than human. Chadran grabbed his harness. Tomas did not react. He continued making the motions of walking, leaning forward against Chadran's grip, the body running the summit program on its own, without any meaningful input from the mind that had designed the program 3 years before. Chadran clipped them together with a short rope, anchoring them as a unit. He radioed base camp again and gave them the full picture. 3 climbers down, all 3 compromised. He could not move all 3 by himself. Base camp had nothing to send. Chadran began moving Tomas downward, using a technique called short roping, keeping the compromised climber close, physically guiding each step, translating the guide's intention into the other person's movement. At 28,000 feet, with a climber who was ambulatory but not self-directing on the steepest section of the southeast ridge, the rate of progress was 100 feet in 22 minutes. He got him back to where Rue and Darwin were waiting. Tomas sat down in the snow when they reached the others. Not a collapse, a deliberate sit, as if he had chosen a reasonable place to stop and rest. He stayed upright. He did not speak. Would this brief pause be enough to regain control, or a precursor to further decline? Rue was on his side. When Chadran reached down and rolled him over, Rue opened his eyes fully and spoke Darwin's name clearly. Then he stopped speaking. His eyes remained half open, the lids not fully raised, not fully closed. Darwin was still breathing. The breath was slow and labored, the intervals between each breath longer than they should have been. The color had left his lips and his fingertips, the blue-gray tone that extreme oxygen deprivation produces when the blood is not delivering enough oxygen to the extremities. He was conscious enough for his eyes to track movement. He was not able to speak or respond to questions. Chadran's 2 clients had between them approximately 40 minutes of supplemental oxygen remaining in their tanks. 3 men needed oxygen. Chadran made the calculation that his clients needed to be able to descend safely to Camp 4 and sent them down. He was now alone at 28,000 feet, with 3 men in various stages of incapacitation, no supplemental oxygen available, and no support coming from below. He tried to get Rue standing. Rue's legs buckled on the first attempt. They buckled on the second. At 214 pounds on a 45-degree ice slope at 28,000 feet, with Chadran needing one hand to manage his own balance, the physics did not work. He could not move Rue by force. He tried a 3rd time and confirmed it. Could brute strength ever overcome physics at this altitude? At 8 o'clock in the morning, Tomas stood up. He stood without being asked, without being touched, without any external prompt. He came up out of the snow where he had been sitting and looked at Chadran directly. Something in Tomas's eyes, in that moment, was different from everything that had been in them for the last several hours. Chadran used the word present when he described it later, a word chosen carefully by a man who had seen the absence of presence at altitude before and understood the difference. Tomas turned and looked at Rue. He turned and looked at Darwin. He said one sentence to Chadran. What that sentence was, Chadran has never repeated publicly. It is the one detail of the entire event that he has kept to himself. Then Tomas sat back down in the snow. At 8:30 in the morning, Rue Achebe's breathing stopped. It did not stop suddenly. It slowed in increments, intervals between breaths extending gradually, the pattern of a body rationing its last resources before the resources run out. Chadran stayed with him for 2 full minutes after the last breath. There was nothing. Rue Achebe, 29 years old, from Columbus, Ohio, was dead at 28,000 feet on the southeast ridge of Everest. Darwin was still breathing. Tomas was still alive. Chadran was the only person on the ridge capable of sustained movement. He clipped Tomas to the short rope again and began working him downward toward the fixed lines that ran toward Camp 4. Short roping a non-responsive climber on steep, icy terrain at this altitude is exhausting work that draws on reserves Chadron had been depleting since his own midnight departure. He moved Tomas methodically, step by step, checking his footing on the ice with each placement. Every few minutes he looked back at Devon, confirming that Devon was still positioned, still upright, still showing some sign. The second time he looked back at Devon, the head had dropped forward, the posture of someone who was no longer holding themselves up. Had Devon already crossed the line beyond rescue? At 9:18 in the morning, Chadron radioed base camp. He reported that Rue was deceased. He reported that Devon was non-responsive. He gave his position on the ridge and continued moving Tomas downward. At 9:45 in the morning, Tomas stopped responding to physical prompting. He was still standing, still clipped to the rope, still vertical, his crampons still in contact with the ice. But when Chadron directed his movement, nothing happened. The mechanism that had been executing walking motions even through the worst of the hypoxia had stopped. Tomas stood on the southeast ridge at 28,000 feet and would not move. Chadron made a decision. He clipped Tomas to the fixed rope using two separate carabiners, a redundant anchor, 2 points of connection to the rope that ran down the ridge toward Camp 4. Tomas was secured to the mountain. He would not fall as long as the anchor held. Chadron told him, in plain words, that he was going down and coming back. Then he unclipped from the short rope and descended alone. He reached Camp 4, retrieved 2 Sherpas who had been waiting there, collected the emergency oxygen cylinders that were available, and went back up the ridge immediately. The round trip cost him time, he knew, precisely that he might not have. Could any delay at this altitude be the difference between survival and death? The return team reached the point where Tomas was anchored at 11:50 in the morning. He was still clipped to the fixed rope. He was seated in the snow, his body held in place by the 2 carabiners exactly as Chadron had left him. He was not breathing. They put the oxygen mask on him and administered emergency flow for 11 minutes. The team worked with focus and without panic, doing exactly what training and procedure called for. After 11 minutes, it was clear nothing was going to respond. They removed the mask. They descended to where Rue lay and to where Davon's body had come to rest. Both were confirmed dead. The team photographed the positions of all 3 bodies, logged GPS coordinates for the official record, and assessed whether recovery was possible. The weight of 3 bodies, the altitude, the terrain between their locations, and any viable descent route, the risks to any recovery team working at this elevation, the calculation produced the same answer it produces in most cases, above 27,000 feet. The bodies would stay where they were. The team packed their equipment and descended to Camp 4. All 3 bodies remained on the southeast ridge of Everest. Nepalese authorities reviewed the case and assessed recovery as non-viable, consistent with standard practice for deaths at extreme altitude. The families of Rue Achebe, Davon Selk, and Thomas Veln were notified through official channels. No recovery mission was mounted. The mountain, as it has done with dozens of climbers over the decades, kept them. Chadron Dorje sustained frostbite on 3 fingers of his right hand and was released from the hospital 4 days after his descent. He gave a full and detailed testimony to the relevant authorities, a statement that became the primary factual record of what happened above Camp 4 on the morning of May 10th. He returned to guiding on Everest the following season. He gave no media interviews. The single sentence that Thomas Veln said to him at 28,000 feet, in the brief, clear moment before the end, has never been made public. Chadron has kept it to himself, and there is no indication that will change. Whatever was said at that altitude, between those 2 men, in the hour before Tomas sat back down in the snow and did not get up again, belongs to a place most people will never go, and none of the 3 ever came back from. It was November 3rd, 2013, on the north face of Mount Everest during the late autumn season. Snow whipped across the mountain, cutting visibility to just a few feet. Only the most experienced teams remained as winter conditions began setting in. Leanda Berungela, 41, a fitness entrepreneur from Miami Beach, had built her career on high-intensity training and motivational content about pushing limits. She had summited several major peaks solo and prided. herself on her independence. Everest was meant to be the culmination of her climbing career, proving that her mental toughness methodology could conquer any challenge. Above 26,000 feet, navigation depends on following established routes marked by fixed ropes and anchor points. Weather can change in seconds, turning a simple path into a deadly cliff. Guides rely on GPS, rope systems, and landmarks to keep climbers safe, especially in low visibility zones. Base Camp had issued repeated warnings about the worsening weather and stressed the importance of staying in sight of assigned guides. Radio check-ins every 15 minutes were mandatory to ensure no one became separated from the group. Berunguela had clashed with her guide throughout the expedition, criticizing his slow pace and insisting her fitness and experience allowed her to move independently. Despite repeated warnings, she pressed ahead whenever possible, convinced she could navigate on her own. During the summit attempt, visibility dropped below 10 feet as blowing snow and thick clouds turned the mountain into a uniform wall of white. The team moved carefully, using fixed ropes and staying within sight of each other. But Berunguela grew frustrated with each pause, seeing safety measures as unnecessary delays. At a critical transition between two fixed-line sections, she chose to move ahead alone rather than wait for her guide to complete safety checks. I kept imagining myself in that situation, thinking I could handle it on my own, and how quickly confidence could turn into real danger. Confident in her memory and navigation skills, she ignored calls to halt and pressed forward. Within minutes, she lost sight of the team and the fixed ropes. Her radio calls grew increasingly urgent as she realized she could no longer identify landmarks or follow the established path. The extreme cold soon took a serious toll. Her GPS failed in the freezing temperatures, leaving her without a reliable way to navigate. She tried retracing her steps, but the endless white landscape offered no clear points of reference. Snow drifted over tracks, and the uniform terrain made it impossible to judge distance or direction. Her guide's radio calls went unanswered as she pressed forward, relying on failing memory and instinct. As hours passed, the weather worsened with strong winds and blowing snow, reducing visibility to near zero. Berunguela unknowingly entered a high-risk avalanche zone. Hypothermia drained her strength, and altitude sickness clouded her judgment. Her calls for help grew weaker, movement slowed, and the mountain's dangers closed in, turning the climb into a desperate struggle for survival. Search teams found her body 4 days later, nearly a mile off the main route. She had spent over 18 hours in the death zone, succumbing to exposure and exhaustion. Her equipment was scattered, showing she had tried to signal for help. The coroner confirmed death from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, with contributing factors including altitude sickness and dehydration. Her final coordinates showed she had been moving in circles, unable to find the main route. The incident underscored the importance of maintaining team cohesion in extreme conditions. Personal strength and determination could not replace teamwork and adherence to proven safety protocols. Fitness industry publications covered the tragedy, noting the fatal consequences of ignoring guidance in extreme environments. Following the incident, her motivational brand quietly disappeared from social media. The mountain had claimed another climber who believed personal excellence could substitute for collaboration, patience, and strict adherence to survival strategies. It was May 21st, 2017, on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest at roughly 28,000 feet, in a season that had packed dozens of climbers into the same narrow summit window. Alina Popa was 26 and worked part-time at a coffee shop in Bucharest, spending 2 years posting budget travel content to TikTok, averaging a few thousand views per clip. Everest was her breakout investment, most of her savings committed to the expedition. Physically, she had trained, and her prior guided summits included Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua. Her previous teammates described her as quiet but stubborn, compliant under supervision, inclined to cut corners when she felt she'd earned it. For me, it seemed like her goal wasn't just the summit. It was capturing the moment raw, which was her undoing. Filming above the balcony wasn't reckless in isolation. The fixed lines had become congested by early morning. Climbers queued in slow, frustrating increments. I think that for someone whose entire purpose on the mountain was documentation, standing still while her phone went unused was a genuine pressure. She filmed the delays, filmed other climbers, and periodically removed her oxygen mask to narrate in short, broken clips into the camera, reseating it each time with visible fumbling through her gloves, but never long enough for the regulator to fully stabilize. Near 28,000 feet, she unclipped from the fixed line to step around a cluster of stopped climbers, moving into deeper and uneven snow for a wider angle. Her Sherpa had instructed her to stay clipped at all times. She stayed off the line longer than he intended. Her oxygen flow rate had already been raised to offset exertion, depleting her supply faster than planned. When she rejoined the line, the margin she had started with was already gone. I think that was the moment this story effectively ended, even if no one recognized it for another few hours. The southeast ridge at 28,000 feet is a narrow spine of wind-packed snow and exposed rock, with open sky pressing in from both sides and nothing to interrupt either the wind or the cold. On descent, the congestion worsened. A German climber positioned directly behind her, and her Sherpa both described her stopping repeatedly, not to rest, but to film, holding her phone toward other struggling climbers and removing her mask to speak into the frame. According to witnesses, her movements were still coordinated but slower and less precise than earlier. Then, near 27,500 feet, her pace dropped noticeably. She struggled to reclip her safety tether, fumbling the mechanism several times before it caught as her hands hesitated at the gate. The German climber heard her speak through the mask, and later told investigators he couldn't parse any of it. She removed her mask again to narrate. When she tried to reseat it, she couldn't manage the fit on the first two attempts, as the mask shifted against her face, covering and stiffened straps. Her Sherpa reached her and found ice forming along the valve and hose, with airflow becoming inconsistent under her breathing. The oxygen tank was nearly depleted. He tried to direct her toward descent. She continued holding the phone up, though the footage was brief and unsteady. The German climber watched the exchange while clipped in place with the line held tight, unable to move forward in the queue. I don't think she understood what was happening to her body, and I don't think anyone could have told her in a way that would have mattered. Then she went to her knees. Her hands became rigid, fingers curled and unresponsive. She was partially moved off the fixed line to clear passage for other climbers. Not a decision made lightly, but one that couldn't wait. Her phone was still loosely in her grip. A descending climber offered supplemental oxygen from his own supply. It was administered briefly but couldn't be spared beyond a few minutes. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. The Sherpa attempted repeatedly to rouse her. She no longer responded to commands or physical contact. The Sherpa radioed down at approximately 7:40 a.m. Supplemental oxygen was requested, but delayed by congestion on the fixed lines. Help reached her position well over an hour later, after slow movement through the line. She was already dead. Medical findings summarized for the expedition record indicated severe hypoxia leading to loss of consciousness at extreme altitude. Her short-form video account was accessed by family after contacting the platform for account control and quietly deactivated within weeks, with most. Public content removed from view. The equipment worked. The weather held. What failed was the distance between what she believed her experience had prepared her for and what the mountain actually required. It was May 19th, 2014, at Camp 4 on a high-altitude expedition's peak in the Nepalese Himalayas. A cluster of tents pressed into compacted snow at roughly 26,000 feet, where the wind doesn't just blow, it dismantles. 3 climbers rested intermittently on supplemental oxygen through what became one of the quietest disasters the expedition would ever document. Nobody heard her go. Nobody heard anything after. Riva Solmund was 38 years old and worked as a structural engineer at a mid-sized consulting firm in Oslo, Norway. She had been climbing for 14 years, alpine routes through Scandinavia and the Alps before moving to the 8,000ers. This was her 3rd attempt at this summit. The first 2 had been turned back by weather, and she spent both trips loudly complaining about guides and stupid restrictions. Her teammates described her as controlling, someone who cross-referenced forecasts across 3 separate services, lectured constantly about their supposed errors, insisted on checking anchor placements herself, despite lacking real skill, and carried a laminated checklist she wielded like a badge of authority. She had taken 6 months of unpaid leave to prepare, though people said that much of that time was spent fussing over gear brands and arguing with trainers about why she deserved a personalized acclimatization plan. She was not strong and not quick, but she demanded the team follow her pace and listen to her advice. Her summit bid was planned for midnight on May 20th. At approximately 10:30 p.m. on the 19th, she left the tent, scowling and muttering about tent mates who slowed her down, insisting she needed air and couldn't wait for anyone else. The South Col is a flat, exposed saddle of glacial rock and ice with no natural windbreak in any direction. At 26,000 feet, jet stream winds can exceed 100 miles per hour without significant warning, and temperatures at night fall below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Cognitive function at that altitude degrades measurably. Spatial reasoning deteriorates, reaction time slows. And critically, none of it feels the way it sounds from sea level. The body keeps moving, the mind just doesn't keep up. Lucen watched her headlamp move away from the tent line. Wind at that point was roughly 25 miles per hour, manageable for the elevation. Over the next hour, conditions shifted hard. Wind climbed past 60 miles per hour, temperature dropped further, visibility collapsed near zero. He called from the tent entrance twice. No response came back. At approximately 11:10 p.m., a climber in a nearby tent briefly spotted a faint light moving low to the ground, not tracking toward the fixed ropes or the camp perimeter, but erratic, close to the snow surface. It lasted a few seconds, then it was gone. That detail, one witness, a few seconds, is essentially all that exists of what happened to her in real time. The snow the next morning filled in the rest. Reva had walked less than 90 feet from the tent before her footprints began to lose direction. Spacing widened, the line drifted. Hypoxia at that altitude produces disorientation functionally indistinguishable from severe intoxication, and it compounds rapidly with cold. Her oxygen mask was found partially dislodged. A single glove was recovered approximately 10 feet away. I've read enough high-altitude incident summaries to know that 90 feet sounds like nothing, and that is precisely the problem. Beyond the glove, the stride marks transitioned into shallow drag impressions consistent with crawling. Based on depth and spacing, investigators estimated that movement covered roughly 15 feet before stopping entirely. Her body was found at approximately 6:40 a.m. by Lucen and 2 other expedition members, less than 100 feet from camp. She was face down, knees tucked beneath her torso, upper body folded forward. Ice had accumulated across her face and neck in dense, layered deposits consistent with several hours of exposure to sustained high-velocity wind. No distress signal had been activated. A mountain rescue liaison was notified by radio at 6:55 a.m. Her body was secured and relocated a short distance from the active camp area later that day due to conditions at that altitude. The expedition medical report later attributed the cause of death as fatal hypothermia with contributing hypoxic impairment. Everyone who knew Reva used roughly the same words: arrogant, controlling, overconfident. She lectured constantly, insisted on being right, and flaunted knowledge she didn't truly have. And still, less than 100 yards from shelter, in a storm that moved faster than any model had predicted, none of it mattered. That's the part most people don't absorb. The mountain doesn't negotiate with entitlement or attitude. It was May 12, 2018, on the upper descent ridge of a high peak in eastern Nepal at approximately 27,000 feet above sea level, a place where the atmosphere holds roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level, and where the margin between functional and non-functional is not measured in effort, but in minutes. Rina Solvek was 28 years old and worked as a freelance translator based in Estonia. She had taken up mountaineering 3 years earlier and had begun documenting her climbs for her TikTok. Colleagues who had climbed with her described her as physically capable. Her conditioning was genuine, her pace on lower elevations consistently strong, but easily distracted when a camera was in her hands. She had framed the expedition as both a personal milestone and a content project simultaneously, and the two goals competed for attention in ways she had not fully resolved before the ascent began. She carried a 2-camera setup alongside her standard high-altitude kit and had hired a Sherpa guide through a regional operations firm based in Kathmandu. The decision to film at the summit was not irrational in intent. She had worked toward that moment for months, and the footage captured there, the views, the wind, her own voice over it, was exactly what her audience had been following the build-up for. The problem was not filming itself. It was that at this altitude, her cognitive performance had already begun to degrade in subtle but compounding ways, leading to shortened attention span, delayed responses, and reduced awareness of time spent on secondary tasks. Oxygen management is not a background task. It requires consistent, active attention. Every pause to adjust a shot, every moment reviewing a clip instead of checking a gauge, reduced the already narrow functional margin she had remaining. Her cylinder had been calculated for a standard ascent and descent with a narrow margin. The filming introduced irregular stops that the planning did not fully account for. Her Sherpa noted during the summit sequence that her flow rate had become inconsistent and that she was beginning to respond with increasing delay when spoken to. He reminded her to monitor the gauge carefully. She acknowledged him with shortened responses and continued filming in intermittent bursts rather than continuous focus. On the early descent, he repeated instructions more firmly as her compliance became less immediate. By the time they reached the upper descent ridge, her oxygen cylinder was depleting ahead of the projected timeline, and the spare was located at a fixed cache point further down the route with travel time that could vary significantly depending on conditions, traffic, and weather. The upper descent ridge drops steeply through wind-packed snow and exposed rock, where the only sounds are the low hiss of oxygen regulators and the crunch of crampons on ice. A climber descending roughly 30 feet behind her later told investigators she had slowed noticeably around 27,000 feet, stopping twice in close succession, once to attempt another filmed segment and once to adjust her mask. Her movements were becoming less coordinated, with pauses between actions that suggested increasing cognitive lag rather than simple fatigue. Her pace did not recover after the second stop. He assumed exhaustion and maintained distance while keeping her in view. Her Sherpa checked her gauge and confirmed it was nearly empty. He immediately initiated a radio call to the lower cache point and instructed her to continue descending without stopping. Her responses were fragmented and slow, often delayed by several seconds, and at times not fully aligned with what had been asked. Her mask shifted slightly during this sequence and was not corrected immediately, further reducing oxygen delivery. Her Sherpa physically steadied her twice as her balance deteriorated. The second time, she dropped to her knees on the slope and required assistance to remain upright. Her gaze was fixed downhill, unfocused, and no longer tracking movement in a coherent way. The climber behind reached them and attempted emergency oxygen sharing through his own regulator in short intervals. The relief was brief and insufficient, providing momentary stabilization without restoring sustained function. She became unresponsive within approximately 4 minutes of going to her knees. Breathing was shallow when the radio confirmation was sent. A second guide arrived later, carrying a replacement cylinder from the lower cache point, but her condition had already progressed beyond recoverable hypoxia. No revival attempts were successful. She was declared dead in the mountain. What happened to Rena feels, in the most honest sense, like a combination of clear technical failure in judgment and a very human refusal to mentally downgrade a goal she had already invested so much into. She was clearly not untrained or unaware. She had real experience, real preparation, and competent support. But she repeatedly treated filming as something parallel to survival, rather than something that had to be fully subordinated to it at that altitude. Her family retrieved footage from her accounts in the weeks following and had it removed. The account was taken down shortly afterward,